In May, Israelis held early elections for prime minister. In an overwhelming victory, Ehud Barak, who many supporters called the messenger of change in the Middle East, was elected. He promised, among other things, to give back parts of the West Bank to the Palestinians. With us this morning to talk about all of this is Josh Rubenstein of Amnesty International, who has been keeping a close eye on the peace accord, Dr. Naseer Aruri, who was born in Jerusalem and has written several books on the conflict. He's a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. And Dr. Eli Krakowski, founder and president of EDK Consulting, a global political and risk management company who has been writing magazine articles on this subject for years. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Let's start with you. What do you make of this whole situation? Are you confident that we will have an end to this conflict in our lifetime?
Well, let me say first, working for Amnesty International, we are studiously neutral on the question of how the Israelis and the Palestinians and the other Arab countries should work out these disagreements. But from the point of view of a human rights organization, I can't say that these accords have made us more optimistic. There have been more incidents of torture, both by the Israelis and by this Palestinian Authority that was created by the Oslo Accords. The Israelis are very determined in their response to violence and terrorism, and they have arrested over 1,000 people each year since the accords were signed, almost all of whom are subject to some form of mistreatment or torture. And on the side of the Palestinian Authority, we know of at least 20 people who have been tortured to death, 20 Palestinians, by their own Palestinian security forces.
But back to the question, do you think that there is hope for an end to this problem here with Mr. Barak in office?
I think there's going to be much more serious negotiations between the Israelis and the Syrians and the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority. I think it's much too soon to say whether we will have a complete resolution to the problem.
Okay. And Dr. Krakowski, what is your opinion of this issue? Do you think that there is hope here?
Well, I would like to think that there is, and there are definitely some signs that show that there is a willingness to move. The question of where these things will go, I think, will very much depend on the fundamentals in the issue as to whether there is a genuine desire to live together. I think that the Israelis are very concerned. Actually, both sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, are concerned about each other. But the Israelis are there, are holding, and the Israelis are the ones who are now being asked basically to yield territory that they control. The Palestinians are the ones who are seeking to get that territory. The Israelis are worried that there isn't that kind of a commitment to accepting the existence of Israel as a state on its own, side by side with the Palestinians.
Dr. Aruri, the Israelis want security. The Palestinians want a home. Can they both find what they want?
Well, nothing really has changed to the issue. Much has been made in the media about the election of Barak. I think that Barak has been portrayed as a person who is going to do that, maybe give the Israelis security and also allow the Palestinians to have their aspirations. I'm afraid that this is not really going to happen. There's just been too much hype about the election of Barak. If you look at Barak's government, it is not really fundamentally different from the government of Netanyahu. More than half of the ministers in his cabinet represent parties that were represented in the previous government. And we find now that Mr. Barak, having really behaved very much like a chief of staff, which is what he was, meeting his opponents one-on-one, playing on their differences and contradictions, coming to see Clinton. He was able to get from Clinton just about everything that he wanted, really. And now he's going back saying that he is not in favor of implementing the Y agreement.
So you're not surprised that he seems to be stalling until February?
I am not really surprised. In fact, February is not a deadline. October, the year 2000, is the one that was mentioned as the end of this process, which should have ended on May 4th, 1999. Okay, but it is important to mention here that Mr. Barak was interviewed by Haaretz here, and he said clearly to the correspondent that this should not be considered as a deadline, October the year 2000. He said this is when we will be in a position, that is to say I, Barak, will be in a position to know whether there is sufficient hope for the final status talks. So you see, it's a process really that has been taken away from the international community. It's been removed from its international framework, and it's been placed into this bilateral framework where the weak becomes at the mercy of the strong. There's a balance of power in favor of Israel, and I don't think that Mr. Barak is going to yield any, much territory. Really.
Dr. Krakowski, do you disagree? Do you think that Mr. Barak is different from Mr. Netanyahu?
Well, I think so. I think he is different, and with all due respect to Dr. Aruri, there are significant differences. The fact that he has some of the same people doesn't change the other fact, which is that he's a very strong person and personality. That he has some of the same concerns as Netanyahu or as any other Israeli leaders is also beyond question. I do think he wants very much to move forward. I think that the fact that he's asking to postpone some of the withdrawals, while I think that from a Palestinian standpoint that can be a worrisome thing, on the other hand, he does want to move towards a final resolution of the overall issue. And I think this should be to the benefit of all the parties, rather than to do a salami process where, when the issue of security for Israel, for the various people who live in the territories where part of the land will be given to the Palestinians. All of those things are very real issues where one cannot, or one probably should not, move ahead without having established the appropriate amount of self-confidence. And I think the overall environment is not all that constructive. I think there's a tremendous amount of resentment on the Palestinian side. I think that there are aspirations on the Palestinian side, at least in certain segments, that are definitely not aiming simply for the West Bank and Gaza, but for a much larger entity with Jerusalem as its capital. Those are real issues. Okay,
let me get back to Josh, too, from Amnesty International. Are you concerned about the hardliners on both sides and how they're affecting the middle?
Well, there's no question. There has been violence by extremists on both sides that have disrupted the negotiations, that have soured the atmosphere. There have been deliberate attacks on civilians by Palestinian extremists, and there have been attacks on Palestinians, both by individual Israelis and what are called the settlers on the West Bank, but also very unfortunate incidents between the Israeli army and police and Palestinian demonstrators. Everyone associates the issue of security with the Israelis, but the Palestinians have legitimate security concerns as well. This relates to the people in jail. This relates to people who are injured or killed during demonstrations where the Israelis have used excessive use of force. Official Israeli presence. I'm not talking about, freelance extremists. And this is an issue for the Palestinians. So I don't think it's fair to associate all security concerns just with the Israelis.
Gentlemen, stay right there. We will continue our discussion when Boston Comment continues right after this. Our discussion now with Josh Rubenstein, Dr. Naseer Aruri, and also Dr. Krakowski. Dr. Krakowski, let's start with you. Some parting thoughts. What do you think about the future of this region?
Well, I think that there is a tremendous need for the Palestinians and the Israelis to be able to live side by side. I think that there are possibilities, and I think the effort needs to be made. At the same time, I think that the underlying background is very important. When one wants to move towards peace, one has to make a tremendous effort. What to me is of concern more than the specifics of an agreement or the timing, whether this occurs this week or next month or next year, although I don't want to minimize. I think more important is the kind of attitudes that is being developed among the people towards living with one another. And here I have some very real concern in the sense that the kind of hatred towards Israel and in many cases towards Jews that one has seen not just among Palestinians but among in the Arab world more generally, doesn't seem to be really going away very much, and that in terms of the training, the education, the textbooks, the Israelis, certainly since the Y agreement, have begun to develop textbooks that encourage living together, positive descriptions of their neighbors. Unfortunately, I think in the Palestinian schools, the textbooks and the attitudes and the description of Israelis and Jews more generally remains very negative.
All right, let me move on there because we want to get our other guests in. Dr. Aruri?
With all due respect, the question is not a question of hatred or a question of curriculum. I think that this is really terribly propagandistic that we hear in the press about textbooks and media. The matter here, the question is, why did this thing happen in the first place? And here I must really disagree with the narration that talked about the Six-Day War that you began the program with, which is reflective, I think, of the way the issue is presented and portrayed here in the United States. I mean, there was something called Palestine, and there were Palestinians living on this land for a long time. The fact that most of these people became refugees in 1948, the fact that the United Nations has a resolution talking about the right of return, I mean, the Kosovar people were accorded the right of return, but this right that has been considered by the global consensus, by the community, by the world community, as a firm right, did not really begin to vanish until the Oslo process. So here we cannot really see much hope for peace unless these major issues are dealt with in accordance with international legality. And I mean by that the issue of Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem is occupied territory. Even until the presidency of George Bush, it was occupied territory. The fact that Israel chooses to say that this is the eternal capital does not make it so. The fact that you have 4.5 million refugees wanting to go home is a very serious issue.
Josh Rubenstein, quickly.
Sure. I think our discussion today reflects many of the tensions that the people in the region themselves have to sort out. And if the U.S. can facilitate those discussions, and if there's open and honest discussion between the Israelis and Palestinians, and a mutual agreement not to resort to force and not to resort to violence, then I think there could be movement forward. But the rights of the Palestinians also have to be acknowledged, along with the security concerns of the Israelis.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it. I'm sorry. I wish we had more time. That's all the time we do have for this edition of Boston Comment. Enjoy your Sunday. Thanks for being with us, and have a great afternoon.